Уважаемые
Dear colleagues,
all the people who would like to speak about the historical problems, мне приятно всех.
it's a pleasure for me to welcome you all here and to see this audience that are ready to discuss problems of history. I'm happy to present our panelists today. Each one of them, of course, has something to say about the subject matter of this discussion. What we're talking about here essentially is why do people need history and do they need history? Also, considering that we're at the Gaidar Forum, the subject matter line is, do politicians need history advisors? Nobody would ask a question, whether politicians need economy advisors. The consensus is that they do. But some people still say, no, they don't need economic advisors. So let's now discuss history advisors. We have a certain sequence of presentations. First, the floor will go to David Priestland, professor of Oxford University. And as far as I know, David, among other things, is going to talk a little bit about what applied history is. I'm very interested in this. Is there an alternative to applied history? Is there a purely theoretical history based on endogenous factors, like internal logic of historical thinking? Is it possible at all? And the second question would be whether there is applied history and what applied history is all about. I hope that our second speaker, Yuri Slyskin, is going to present a very interesting report about, he's going to talk about the centers of history studies there are on the global map, and what history in which macro region would be the history. What are the differences between histories and what are the common points there? There's an interesting case from David Engerman, professor of history of the Yale University. He's going to talk about the previous period of history thinking and his case about Soviet history experts from the 20th century. And I'm sure David's going to talk about other things as well, but there's a great book and great research devoted to the subject from him. And Georgi, I don't know how to call you, what to call you, a history or a sociologist, a teaching professor. Okay, thank you, Georgi. So, Georgi, as one of the people who is very close to Noel Weilerstein, who passed away recently, he's going to be within this company as a person who is going to tackle many things, maybe respond to the previous speakers, but he is going to do an impromptu presentation, and we'll see how it works. So this is the plan. We have 4 great people here, great history experts. They are going to talk about their subjects of expertise. And David Priestland, please.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in English. Thank you very much for those very kind words in introduction. So I'd like to begin this discussion of public history, as it's sometimes called, applied history, with a recent case when historical advice and analysis had a major impact on political decision-making. The invasion of Iraq by the American and British-led, British played a rather minor role, coalition in 2003. Now, arguments based on historical parallels were absolutely central to the justification to invade. Some of them were made by professional historians, though most of them were made by people we might call public intellectuals and journalistic commentators. These people argued that Saddam Hussein's regime was similar to that of Hitler's and other regimes they defined as totalitarian regimes. They included the USSR, Imperial Japan. And the lesson of history was that these regimes had to be confronted militarily. As Andrew Roberts, who's a historian well known in Britain, probably not very well known here, who writes books on Churchill and the Second World War, though he doesn't have an academic post, I mean, he writes perfectly respectable and good books of political biography. But he is a public intellectual in Britain, and he wrote just before the war, quote, "The situation with Iraq is close to that of the late 1930s, when a fascist dictator stealthily acquired weapons of mass destruction, the Luftwaffe's bombing arm, and attempted to acquire nuclear weapons too. That totalitarian dictator later invaded his neighbor, as Saddam did, gassed his political and racial enemies, as Saddam has, and brutalized and tortured his own people, as Saddam does." So these sorts of parallels between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan on the one hand and Saddam Hussein's Iraq were common also among the neoconservative politicians who actually pursued this war-driven policy. And it also affected post-war policy of the American government. They used these arguments to claim that the Ba'ath regime in Iraq could easily be eradicated to make way for the coming of a pro-Western liberal democracy. So, for instance, Douglas Faith, the Undersecretary of State for Defense under Rumsfeld, argued for the need to, quote, de-Ba'athify Iraq, that is, purge the state apparatus of Ba'ath Party members, using the analogy of denazification. And this policy of de-Ba'athification was pursued for just over a year after the invasion of Iraq. As he explained, quote, "I could not imagine General Dwight Eisenhower thinking he would liberate Germany without abolishing the Nazi political apparatus." However, at the same time, other historians were warning against this course. Charles Tripp, who is a historian of Iraq at London University, probably one of the main experts in Britain, was invited to 10 Downing Street to meet Tony Blair with two other experts in the region, just before the war, just before the decision to invade. And when I discussed the meeting with him a few years ago, he told me that once Blair had realised the experts didn't think the invasion would have positive outcomes, he had little interest in what they had to say. He was quite keen to end the meeting. As Tripp wrote later, quote, "I felt he wanted us to reinforce his gut instinct that Saddam was a monster. It was a weird mixture of total cynicism and moral fervour," was his judgment. Sorry, that was an interview actually with somebody else, with a journalist. So for Tripp, the problem wasn't too much historical advice, but too little, and the fact that the advice given was ignored. So, of course, Tripp and his experts predicted more or less what would happen, i.e. that there would be a great deal of opposition to the invaders, and purging Ba'ath Party members would only fuel a sectarian civil war. And these decisions, I think virtually everybody agrees now, perhaps not everybody, but a lot of people agree, were clearly some of the most misguided and disastrous in recent times. And these decisions lie behind much of the turmoil in the Middle East today. So what light does this example of applied history cast on the notion of on the idea of historians as political advisors. Was the disaster the result, or was there a contribution of too much historical advice or too little, or was it advice of the wrong sort? And if the latter, how can we know which historical advice is good advice? Now, today, I want to argue that Charles Tripp was right, that historians should be more part of the policy process, but I also want to argue that some of those who are most favourable to historians' involvement often have a misguided view of the sort of approaches historians should adopt. Now, one of the most vocal and coherent defences of historians' place in the policy sphere is the manifesto written by Graham Allison and Neil Ferguson, founders of Harvard University's Belfer Centre on Applied History. They wrote this in 2016. Indeed, they have urged the White House to establish a Council of Historical Advisors on the lines of, or in imitation of, the President's Council of Economic Advisors, who would use their study of the past to cast light on current policy choices and assess possible consequences, i.e. using the past to shed light on, even if not actually predicting the future. The reason this doesn't happen, they argue, is because historians and politicians have grown apart. They complain that many historians view those who seek to apply history to public policy with contempt, and they also complain that politicians ignore history, especially as they put it in what they call the United States of amnesia. Now, I think other speakers are going to say more about the role historians have played in the policy sphere, but clearly historians as a group in history have been very close to power. From the ancient period, medieval chroniclers were very important in legitimizing regimes and power. And they are probably right, Allison and Ferguson are probably right, that historians have lost influence compared with that past over the last few decades. And I think both historians and politicians are responsible for that gap. Clearly, the rise of the economics profession to a position of political influence from the interwar period, an influence that has only grown from the post-war period, and particularly with the rise of market neoliberalism in the 1970s, clearly economists have become much more central to the policy process. Politicians see one of their main jobs as to promote growth and improve living standards, and economists have been able to cast themselves as social scientists able to predict the future if certain courses are followed and give clear, unambiguous policy advice, which gives politicians confidence, even though sometimes, of course, that economic advice can be misplaced, as we've seen in recent years. But also, I think many historians have also encouraged the separation between history and policy making because of developments in academic history, in university-based history, since the 1970s. The turn against a previously fashionable Marxist social structural history, or more broadly social structural history, made it deeply unfashionable to argue that there are deep structures and constants in history that lead to predictable outcomes, or have led to predictable outcomes. It also became uncommon to see history as a teleological process, an idea that it was moving in a particular direction according to these long-term constants or historical laws or whatever. And partly in reaction to these structuralist and deterministic approaches to history, historians increasingly emphasize the importance of historical context, the context of the time, and the differences, therefore, between the past and the present. Rather than continuities, rather than constants between different periods, each period is its specific world, and we really got to emphasize differences between these periods. We can't see that many constants between those periods. Now, we see that most radically in the thought of theorists such as Michel Foucault, who argued for a series of major radical changes of worldview in history, or Thomas Kuhn, the historian of scientific revolutions. Both of these people argued that really all these, the past was really a foreign country where these are fundamentally different periods. So if that's the case, what can these past periods teach us about today? Surely Hitler and Saddam lived in completely different cultures, operated in wholly different circumstances and environments and contexts. According to this view, it is absurd, really, to make comparisons between the two and draw lessons from one's responses to Hitler when dealing with Saddam Hussein. Now, if we return to the Belfer Centre of Applied History, this manifesto is aware of the need to avoid a very overly scientistic form of certainty. It calls for nuance. It says we can't be certain that the past is like the present. We can't be certain that there are these laws of history or forces of history that apply in all of these periods. But it seems to me that the examples it uses and its language suggest it really does want historians to turn sharply against these recent historic developments in academic history and go back to a much more structural social science approach to history and in a way become more like economists. This is why they use the term applied history. So just as they say doctors are applied biologists, there should be a group of applied historians who bring the insights of academic history to politics and are the interface between politicians and academic history. And also, I think, at the root of their approach lies the assumption that there are long-term constants in history, which can be isolated and used to develop explanatory generalizations, just as social scientists do. And they reveal this assumption, I think, in the fact that they take a particular quotation from the Greek historian Thucydides as their founding principle. The quote is, "Events of future history will be of the same nature, or nearly so, as the history of the past, so long as men are men," i.e., there are these constants in history. At the root of their approach is the assumption that there are long-term constants which can be isolated and used to develop these explanations. Now, Thucydides' quotation, it seems to me, points to the major problem with this view of applied history, that it exaggerates the similarity between different cases, and that is in turn founded on the belief that one can identify and isolate a decisive historical force that is constant over time. And this was a view, I think, intelligently challenged by a more recent historian, Marc Bloch, the famous French historian who wrote much of his work in a Nazi prison during the war. He wrote this just before his imprisonment. He wrote, quote, "History is, in its essentials, a science of change. It teaches us that no two events unfold in the same way, because the circumstances never coincide exactly. No doubt, history recognizes in human evolution elements which are not permanent, elements which, if not permanent, are at least lasting. But it is to admit at the same time the almost infinite variety of their combinations." So historians have to deal with, to pursue Bloch's analysis, while economists can isolate constants and plausibly relate them to a number of variables to make predictions. So the experience of the financial crisis of 1929 is wholly relevant to that of 2007 to 8. Historians have to take account of many more forces than economists, all operating on each other in ways that make the future difficult to predict. They have to take account of the different cultural context in which people make decisions, something behavioral economists are learning they have to do as well, but they're also interested in the interaction between economic forces and many other forces as well. They're interested in the interaction between economic forces, social forces, political forces, the psychology of individual leaders. They also have to take account of wholly unpredictable contingency. So historians may be able to isolate some constants in human history, but there are many more variables. And it was this overconfidence in the ability to find constants in history that contributed to the disaster in Iraq. The notion that there was something called a totalitarian regime that was driven by its ideology to behave aggressively, that is constant over time. and applies to Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, the USSR, and Saddam's Iraq. And therefore, only force could stop that type of regime. Now, many, including myself, would question the analytical usefulness of the whole concept of totalitarianism. But even if it were a useful concept and could be applied to Saddam's regime, to focus on this alone and this set of forces alone ignores a whole range of other forces. For instance, the international relations context, the huge military imbalance between the US and Iraq, which make the circumstances wholly different from those of the 1930s. So the question then is, should we abandon the whole idea of policy-relevant history? I think not, and I think I'd agree with Charles Tripp that there is a place for historians as advisors, and indeed they should be called in to advise politicians more than they had been. And that was Charles Tripp's point. He complained that he hadn't been called in by the Foreign Office to give more advice on Iraq. But I would argue that they need to be the right sort of historians who are not going to exaggerate constants in history and are going to balance them with context and take account of contingency. And I think this argument is borne out, and this is my final point, by the fascinating work of 2006 from the field of psychology, Philip Tetlock's book, Expert Political Judgment. Now, Tetlock analysed, it's an interesting book, he analysed the writings of some 300 commentators and academics from history and other disciplines who were involved in the business of prediction on the basis of analysis of the past. For instance, he looked at historians, commentators, journalists, who looked at issues like what was going to happen in 1989 as the Soviet Union and the communist regime started to crumble. He then tried to find out whether their conclusions had been borne out and what the most successful and least successful analysts had in common. Interestingly, one thing that made little difference to their levels of success was educational level, i.e. whether they had a PhD or not. Nor was it their political views, whether they were right-wing or left-wing. Rather, he argued what was decisive was their cognitive style, their style of thinking. And he took a distinction drawn by the political theorist Isaiah Berlin between hedgehogs and foxes. Hedgehogs know one thing, foxes know many things. To argue that the least effective forecasters were those who, like the hedgehog, had a simple, elegant explanatory model which they believe can be applied everywhere. So they were the least successful. Both foxes and hedgehogs had failures as well as successes, but far more effective were, and far the most effective, and more effective than sort of random judgment, were foxes who were not committed to one approach or perspective, but were able to take account of multiple perspectives, who were willing to recalibrate their framework in the light of new information and arguments. And this is an issue of thinking style rather than one of narrowness or breadth of interest. Some of the worst performers were hedgehogs, i.e. people interested in elegant models, in their area of expertise, which is a relief for me as I have a broader rather than more specialised historical interests. So the fact that Charles Tripp was an expert on Iraq, Andrew Roberts wasn't, was not the crucial issue. Rather, it was the way they thought and analysed information. This finding, of course, makes sense if we go back to history and to Mark Bloch's view of history as the science of change. If history is the study of many varied combinations of historical forces, then hedgehogs who will consider only one of those forces are unlikely to have much insight or success. But the variability of those forces does not mean we should just give up and say everything is contingent, everything is changeable, the past can't tell us anything about the present. As the relative success of foxes shows, it seems we can discern some constants or regularities if we have the right fox-like thinking style. Now, unfortunately, the nature of modern communications and culture, where there are so many people and issues vying for our attention with social media, is an environment made for hedgehogs, not foxes. For the big arguments of the hedgehog can be easily packaged for the media. They'll get a lot of attention from politicians. These will be are likely to be chosen by politicians. And in fact, Tetlock found that those who had more media exposure were rather less successful in their predictions. So, if the answer to the original question, should politicians retain historical advisors, is yes, if they have the right approach to the job, another question arises. Are the dangers of acting on damaging advice from historians, from bad historians, outweighed by the possibility that you might get good advice? But to answer that question, I think I'd need to do some historical research first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. But David, мне кажется, что ты...
I think this was a good start for our conversation. Now over to Yuri Slaskin. I'm going to refer to facts in my presentation. If you ask historians for advice or recommendations, then you first have to find an answer to the question, what do they know? What makes them experts? Whose past have they studied? Me and my colleague Alexander Martin have put together a very approximate map of historic communities. We looked at the subjects that they have been studying. There are historians everywhere. If there is a state, it may not have an army, but it has schools, and if there are schools and there are history lessons, when there are history lessons, it means that there is at least one historian and at least one textbook. The biggest group is shown in blue. Let's call it Group 1. These are countries that study their own past exclusively. These are countries that have research centers where over 80% of historians focus on national history. This is a group where we find countries of Asia, Africa, Latin America, Oceania, countries that do not have much wealth, but also we find several European countries, including almost all post-communist regimes. More than 80% of all studies are focused on national research. That leaves very little space for studies of the rest of the world. The most popular subject for historians is the combination of national myths, victories, a martyrdom for some, and a combination of those things for others. They also look at different volumes. There are countries like Iceland or Latvia or Ukraine. Most of historians in those countries study national history, and this means that their studies are limited to the borders of their state. Plus, they also look at some neighbor territories. There are countries like Spain. They study their history, the past of their country, and they publish a lot of research. The past that they examine includes the history of Latin America, Philippines, and a large part of Europe. Portugal. In Portugal, 90% of historians, according to our assessments, focus on the studies of Portugal Empire, which includes Macau, Goa, and Timor, and other countries where people speak Portuguese, including Brazil, of course. Look at Georgia. Historians there study the medieval history of their country and the links that their nation had with other empires. What are the main subjects that historians look at? In Latvia, historians focus on the 20th century exclusively. The two world wars, two periods of independence, occupation, and deportations. In Spain and in Portugal, they focus on the golden age of the empires, and they also look at the dictatorship regimes of the 20th century. In Lithuania and in Georgia, they look at the golden century of their empires, and they look at the empires and the sufferings of the 20th century. Iceland, they focus on their golden age of colonialism and the triumph of the 20th century. In Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, and South African Republic have biggest histories. In Latin America, Mexico and Brazil have biggest histories, and historians study local history most of the time. In Brazil, there are political reasons for which historians have been very active in African studies. In all those countries, the majority of historians use their national language, their native language, for their research. It's their native language for some. In Latin America, most historians study national history, and some study continental history as well. Interestingly, India is a different case. They focus on Indian history exclusively. Most researchers use English, and that opens access to international research centers of Indian history studies. The Indian history studies are taught in the United States by members of Indian diaspora. A few words about diaspora. Local historians have their sphere of interest, and it's interesting to look who else finds such studies relevant and attractive. Much depends on the geopolitical significance of a region. There are some communities that are focused on the events in other parts of the world. In Armenia, for example, historians focus on the history of Armenia, but there are also some scholars of Armenian history in the United States and in France. But again, that's ethnic Armenians that do that. In Ukraine, 90% of historians focus on Ukrainian history. There are also some scholars in Canada. They are people of the Ukrainian origin. The geopolitical significance of Ukraine is growing through the efforts of those scholars in Canada, in the United States, and in Germany. Now, let us look at the second group, highlighted in green. These are countries with a lot of research. 20 to 40% of historians study somebody else's past. They study the history of regions which are other than their own, and the regions that they do not have direct connection to. These are countries that do not try to cover all of the world. They focus on some regions and they ignore others. In this group, you find Japan, Korea, Vietnam, which is moving in that direction. It has been in recent years. We also see that this is quite a popular direction in Europe. France, Germany, Austria, Italy are in this group. I can say that Italy is on the border between Group 1 and Group 2. This group also includes the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden. Why are they so open and internationally oriented? There are several reasons. Some of them are obvious. They have good funding. For some of these countries, their imperial past matters, and in the last 30 or 40 years in Europe, especially in Northern Europe, they try to avoid nationalism by all means. And it has become kind of a taboo. They are all focused on multiculturalism. In a number of countries, we see an opposition to the national accent in history studies. In these countries, historians usually use their native language as well as English for their writings. Especially so in France and in Germany. These countries are academic empires. They are attractive for students from different parts of the world. Many students go to study in France and in Germany from Eastern Europe. These scholars have big book markets. So a lot of publications are in the national languages. That happens there a lot more than in the Nordic countries. Finally, the third group, what I would call cognitive empires. These are countries that are trying to cover everything. in the center of today's world, economically, financially, militarily, information-wise, we see Anglo-American empires. The United States and the former metropoly, the former superpower of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and two colonies of Great Britain, New Zealand and Australia, two former colonies. These countries are united in a union often referred to as Five Eyes. They exchange intelligence, information, and they also have a common scholar community, scientific community. They have their own market for research. These countries are joined by Ireland, which stands apart because this is the only country in the English-speaking world that has ethnic nationalism, and up to 50% of historic writing deals with this national idea. There are also two non-English speaking countries in this group which are using English for historic writings. That is the Netherlands and Israel. Israel is an interesting case. They have quite high degree of nationalism, and they also show the global outreach. Global historians study the history of the Jewish people, and that makes them study different regions of the world. The level of studies, the intensity of studies is determined by different economic and geopolitical reasons. Much depends on presence of ethnic groups and diaspora in different parts of the world. Of course, that has an impact on geopolitics and other things. In the United States, the history of Europe was studied in Harvard in the mid-19th century. In Columbia and Chicago, they started teaching the history of Western civilization. These programs have become quite universal in American universities throughout the country, and this has become kind of a foundation of the ideology of the free world at the time of the Cold War. This construction started deteriorating in the 1960s. By that time, there were a lot of area study centers, and they are together creating the world history studies. I would say that only one quarter of historians focus on the local history studies. In Canada and in Australia, even less than 25%. It could be even less unless there was a difference between the subjects of studies and the subject of teaching. The number of American studies experts depends on the needs of universities, because this is one of the compulsory subjects in universities. If that changes, then that is going to make changes in specialization of some historians. This is another subject, by the way, quite interesting. There is a huge difference between what professional historians study and what they teach in schools. In the countries that are highlighted in blue, where nobody studies other nations' histories. They teach world history in schools up to 50% of the time, even more in some countries.
Getting back to the area centers, Latin American studies as a professional area of historical science started to be developed before the Second World War within the framework of the Monroe Doctrine, and the missionaries who came back from that area formed the first centers for the study of Chinese and Japanese history. By 1960s, the centers of regional research were very many already, and the number of specializations in history and departments also increased dramatically. Again, at least ideologically, and the argumentation of leading research centers of Anglo-American Empire, the tendency was for global coverage. The world would be broken down into regions, and colleagues considered that they should train experts on each of the regions. In effect, that would not be a really global coverage, at least that's what they say, and intend to do, global coverage. And just a few words about two other cognitive empires, which is China and Russia. In China, unlike the Anglo-American academic world, more than 50% of historians deal with the national history. And actually, another interesting thing to note is this. In blue countries, those few historians who study history of other nations, they while mainly focused on the history of Western Europe and the United States, while the official ideology of the leading nations right now, starting from the old nations of Mesopotamia and incorporating the Greek and Roman ancient world. In Asia, they would add the history of China. So China, most of the historians deal with the Chinese history there, but area studies are growing very quickly over the past 20, 30 years, including, well, in many areas, including history. Centers to study not only China, Japan, Korea, and Europe, but also Southeast Asia, India, Islam, the Arabic world, Africa, and many regions in Africa, also Latin America and other regions. Clearly, Anglo-American and Chinese cognitive empires are different. They're not symmetrical. Of course, in the Anglo-American world, China is one of the areas they study, an important one, but just one of the many. For China, the Anglo-American world is also a place where they should publish, and entering which is very important for your career growth, and is promoted by the government. Russia, this is another center, and you know that Russia inherited a lot from the Soviet Union. That was an attempt for global coverage that they inherited. And an interesting, and it was a surprise for me, Belarus has a similar approach, the only post-communist country which did not move to an official ethnic nationalism, as far as I know. They've maintained the Soviet academic science, and it's more than 50% of world history among history researchers there. And my final point, exceptions. I was surprised that, well, Switzerland, I should have asked you, actually, and the answer, Switzerland. We have it in black here, the only country. Why so? On the one hand, they do not pretend they have a global coverage. Very little literature in English, and they're part of French or German academic world in that respect. But on the other hand, they don't do much of their history, almost nothing of that. I was surprised, not a single chair that would be called the chair of Swiss history. That's an interesting episode here, and an exception. But Russia, finally, it may turn green at some point in time, maybe not. You will see. You can tell us what you think about that. Thank you. Thank you for this macro regional or macro area map. David, please.
So, like most historians, I take a question about the role of historians today by looking to the past. And I'll say something that amounts to what historians say at every interdisciplinary event, which is that no matter what the question, it started earlier and it's more complicated. So I'll proceed along those lines here to suggest, of course, that we do need applied historians in the policy world. But in part, perhaps even in large part, to solve our own jobs crisis in history. But nor is this the first situation time we've faced this kind of situation. I'm going to focus my remarks on the American experience and on foreign policy expertise, but would be open and interested in kind of other comparisons in question and answer. My ultimate conclusion is that we actually don't need more historical advisors, but we need more history teachers in policy, and I'll explain where that comes from. But first I want to start by talking about the tradition of American historians engaged in government policy, building on the book that Dean Zuev mentioned, and turn especially to the 1940s, when the United States was becoming, in Yuri Sloskin's wonderful term, a cognitive empire, of sorts, seeking to know not just its own national history, but the history of the whole world. It should also be noted, as Yuri also alluded, that Cold War mobilization also called for a new kind of U.S. history along the lines of some genealogies of a free world, in which the United States, of course, was the ultimate successor. It's at this moment that what had been histories of civilization that happened to only cover the West became histories of Western civilization, so named and so defined. While my remarks are mostly, or well, exclusively on the United States, I would suggest that there are transformations in Soviet scholarship in the Akademia Nauk in the 1950s that bear some interesting comparisons worth considering. At the time World War II ended, there were fewer than a dozen people in the 12 people in the United States government who spoke Russian. Never before, as one historian at Columbia said, did so few people know so little about so much. Right? And led by this historian at Columbia by the name of Geroyd Robinson, generally an obscure figure and perhaps deservedly so, he and a number of others created Soviet studies as an academic powerhouse over the course of subsequent decades, building large programs at Robinson's own Columbia, at Harvard, at Yuri's Berkeley. I'm sorry to say not so much at Yale University, but we're trying still to rectify that. And it was, in this sense, the paradigm of a new kind of area studies, of regional studies in this form. It focused on history, but also Sovietology was profoundly interdisciplinary. The argument was that what policymakers needed was not just the knowledge of any one discipline, but the knowledge of all disciplines brought together and concentrated on a single question. So historians, I think, played a particularly important role in here. The role was multiple. I think it's especially strong in connections between universities and intelligence agencies. Columbia, Harvard, and Yale had their own historians, had their own people who provided not just advice, but also connections to the intelligence agency. All of them were historians, I think, which is worth noting. It's also a period in the 1940s where it's not just historians, but social scientists are more enamored of engaging in formal policy. There's the term policy sciences is coined toward the end of World War II, looking ahead toward a post-war period. And yet one fan of policy engagement, an anthropologist as it happens, conceded that by and large the effort was a failure. And he suggested that the social sciences failed to shape policy not because of bad advice, and certainly not because of bad social science, but because of the way that social science was used in policy and in politics. This anthropologist said, and here I'm quoting, "The politician uses social science like a drunk uses a lamppost, for support rather than illumination." Right? That this have already been alluded to in here. David Priestland's Iraq case, which were seeking historians to reinforce a gut instinct. So the effort to bring about the social sciences, including for these purposes history, into the policy world was effective at one level. It actually built an extraordinary edifice and provided a scholarly edifice, intellectual edifice, a pedagogical edifice as well. There would be far more than 12 students in any one university's advanced Russian classes every semester, so it's exceeding the number of Russian speakers in the US government at the close of World War II. So it's a remarkable success in some ways, but not necessarily in the ways that we're talking about here in having historians advise and shape policy. I should also note that this large-scale mobilization that affected Russian studies, but all area studies, was in large degree based on the same Munich analogy that was used about Iraq, right? This Munich analogy was very common, the references to the 1930s and now the Soviet Union being seen as the next quote-unquote totalitarian threat. So these efforts to bring about, I would say, systematized connections between academe, especially academic historians, and policy never really succeeded. They were replaced, I think, by a different model of one I would think of as policy entrepreneurship. Individuals with university training, some historians, some otherwise, made their way into the policy world. Zbigniew Brzezinski as one crucial example, Henry Kissinger, of course, as another. In later generations, it was Madeleine Albright, Dennis Ross, Condoleezza Rice, who helped bring us the Iraq War, all involved as individual entrepreneurs, not as working to represent a discipline or a facultät, but as individuals. This, in some ways, is actually not so different from what preceded it. If we look at the historians who are active in policy in earlier periods, in the 1950s and 1960s, the two names that first come to mind are George Kennan and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Now, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., it should be noted, his father, Sr., was a professional historian. Schlesinger never actually got a PhD in history, although he taught on history faculties before he went to advise Kennedy. George Kennan, of course, was a prize-winning historian, but this was as a second career after his career as a diplomat and policy advisor had more or less come to an end. I would suggest that what both of them brought to the field was not so much historical knowledge and certainly not professional historical credentials, but a historian's sensibility, and I'm going to turn more to that in just a minute. The one side note I'd make here is that the legacy of American historians in politics proper is in fact quite a dismal one. If we go back to Woodrow Wilson, who was a historically minded political scientist, the only American president with a PhD, it's hard to see where his historical background and his social scientific background more broadly shaped, especially positively shaped, his policies. If we look more recently at another historian, actually also a history professor, who ran for president in 1970, he 1972, George McGovern was not so great a historian, but a spectacularly unsuccessful presidential candidate against Nixon, President Richard Nixon in 1972. And perhaps more recently, I hope these remarks don't get back to our campus, U.S. Senator Ben Sasse, who has a history PhD from Yale, wrote a dissertation on secularism and the religious right in the 1980s, ultimately taking essentially one side of the story. Spoiler alert, it was not the side of secularism. And he too, we can see, is using history for support rather than illumination. So where does this leave applied history? Neil Ferguson and Graham Allison, what David Priestland rightly called the Balfour Manifesto, called for a council of historical advisors, hopefully by their counts to reach the same success as the Council of Economic Advisors had. I would suggest that not just is a council of advisors, historical advisors, an impossibility politically, I'm actually not even sure it's advisable. And I'd suggest this because we need different kinds of history, not just different interpretations, but different approaches and different mindsets to the past, right? All of us, of course, draw on the past as social scientists because it's rather difficult to draw on the future, and the present changes too quickly for us to account for, right? And the way we end up using our study of the past could take place, I would say, in at least three different registers. The first is information, what happened. The second, interpretation, how do we understand the causes and consequences of what happened? And the third is application, how, if at all, do these interpretations inform our current situation? As far as the first of these registers, information, goes, we already have this under normal circumstances. History majors, history degrees are a clear path to entering the foreign service, to becoming a diplomat. The same is true in intelligence work. There's plenty of staff-level expertise across the government in historical knowledge, but also historical sensibility. The problem is that gets so digested by the time it reaches the most senior ranks. When we get to the second register of interpretation, I think we have to confess that reasonable people, even reasonable historians, may differ on topics. Differ in their interpretations. It's not that history teaches us anything. I'm always wary of anyone who say that history teaches us anything. It's that historians teach us things, and different historians, for their own reasons, will suggest different policies. Per the line of bureaucratic politics that was coined actually by none other than Graham Allison, one of the authors of the Balfour Manifesto, where you stand depends on where you sit. That is, your policy preferences will be based on your current, essentially, bureaucratic position. So history remains just as much a prisoner of the present as anything else. And the third question about application is also very difficult. American investment companies, when they advertise on television, also have this disclaimer that past performance is no guarantee of future results. And this is true for historians as well. I much prefer the line of a much-loved sports hero, American sports hero, who said, "It's hard to predict anything, especially the future." Right? My conclusion from all this is what we need is not a sort of historical advice, but we need to teach historical sensibility. We don't need historical advisors as much as we need history teachers. Right? We need a deeper account, a deeper understanding of unfamiliar events. We need a deeper understanding of others' accounts of those same events, right? We need to overcome the overconfidence that David Priestland rightly mentioned in his talk. To use the line he took from Isaiah Berlin here, was that we need to teach a certain kind of foxiness, if you will, multiple perspectives, multiple directions, multiple kinds of knowledge. We also need to teach a sense of humility. There are no solutions for all time, only, as the American philosopher William James had it, truth in so far forth, right? This is not a call for a post-truth world, but one that recognizes that all moments, even our own, are time-bound. They require historicizing, right? So ultimately, even more than having card-carrying historians in policy circles, we need history teachers imparting a history worldview, a historian's boot camp, if you will, for politicians and policymakers to teach multiple perspectives, to teach and to embody the value of empathy, not to be nice, but to be effective, and finally, to teach humility. And with these conclusions, I humbly rest. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David. Мне даже интересно.
I wonder what Georgi is going to say after the first three panelists with such different angles. Over to you, Georgi. I think people may be tired from so much science. Let me start by telling you a joke. It's a historical joke. A long time ago, I was a postgraduate student, and we heard that they were splitting the country's budget, and most money went to the rocket science and nuclear science. And one man stood up and said, we understand that the country needs a nuclear power, but the problem is that nuclear scientists like to read some history books before they go to bed. So we also need some. We cannot think of anything new. That comes to the point of funding for history studies. Ron Robert, who is now the president of Haifa University, once said how in 1945 and 1946 in the United States they created a lot of different think tanks. We still don't have a term for this in the Russian language. What was happening back then? People who were not very successful in the academic community looked at others. They saw how much influence nuclear science got at the time of World War II. Between 41 and 45, the funding for the nuclear science grew by 100 times, not 100%, but 100 times. There were a lot of prisoners of war in the camps, so we may work with those Koreans and see how their ideology is built. Maybe we can convert them to our ideology. We need to know our enemies. I am a graduate of the Institute of Asia and Africa Studies. I studied one of rare languages that few people know that exists. Somebody said that in the United States they had several departments of that language studies. So if we ever go to the region in Africa where they speak that language, we need to speak the language. When the Soviet Union collapsed, this was very detrimental to the development of science in the United States. NASA suffered greatly, and several regional studies centers or area study centers have suffered a lot. There were new requirements for those centers. There's no Indian economy or Russian economy. There is good economy or bad economy, and a real economist is like a business professional. You can move that person from one region to another, and he or she will always do a good job. If you put an expert in a country that has a Marriott hotel that person would work there successfully. They would organize events, they would set up businesses, and things would get moving. I agree that there is a need for advice. This is something that the previous presenter said in a lower voice, and I can say it loudly. We need wages, we need salaries, we need good salaries. People who make political decisions. When were they taking history classes last time? When they were in secondary school, I talked to people who have serious positions in the government, and they asked me what was going on in Poland. Suvorov was sent to fight there. We heard about Tadeusz Kościuszko. Where can we do some reading about Poland? The history of Poland is not taught in Russian schools. I was quite desperate about that, and I wrote an article. The far Western Slavic nation, almost like Russians, but completely different. They have a different religion. They have been a part of the Renaissance process, and their state collapsed a few times. Well, we need to promote history studies at different levels. I do this all the time. There are so many questions coming in my direction. People are asking me, is there going to be a war with Iran? This is a very relative question for me personally, because the day after tomorrow I am going to go home and my aircraft is supposed to fly through Iranian airspace. We can say that the teaching of Fernand Braudel is very relevant today. Now, pay attention to something else. Who are the leading commentators on the economic crisis of 2008? Adam Tooze, Swet Beckert, another historian. The most popular program in Harvard is taught by the gentleman who teaches capitalism for postgraduate students. He thought that he would have 2 or 3 students in the program, but it turned out that he has 28. There is a need for historians. There's a demand for them from the bottom, and there is some demand from the top. But then again, one can find many ways to use a light post. Any intelligence system works as a funnel. At the bottom, there are people who gather facts. Then it goes up, and it becomes more narrow higher up. What do people on top want to hear? What can be safely presented to the top-level people? I have a lot of personal experience. I remember meeting one American colonel. He was a part of the Iraq invasion planning group, and I asked this gentleman, when you crushed the government of Iraq, when you got access to huge wealth, did you think about the robbery and looting that would take place after the invasion? He was very professional. He said, this is police business. Our business is to destroy enemy army. Army fights in another nation's army. I have just one more thing to say. I don't want you to get the impression that today we're looking at a parody. I am a historian and I am a social scholar. Why things are happening the way we see. Well, since 1970s, we have invented a lot of new terms like stagflation, inflation, depreciation. Sounds very science-like. There was a group of social scholars that really scared politicians. Before that, the economies were growing. In the 50s, in the 60s, and in early 70s, we saw good growth, and all governments in the world, in America, in the Soviet Union, and in India, people explained that by having good political and historic knowledge. They believed that they had good advice. Who were the main advisors in the early 20th century? Just think about it. Engineers, railroad workers. Railroad engineers were very important advisors for governments in the countries that had governments. In the colonial period, not every country had a government. What happened before the 18th century? Who were the main scientific advisors to governments? Astrologists. Think about that. Astrology was a global science. This is an amazing thing. They had it in Japan. They had it in Central America. I'm not clear if we had astrologists in Russia. Maybe the climate was wrong. Well, probably they had astrologists in Russia too. This is a discipline that has very deep roots that go to the times of Babylon. Many centuries of observations, mathematical explanations and theories. They had their training programs. People were getting training from the gurus of astrology. Different civilizations shared knowledge. The works on astrology were translated into different languages, and it worked. Everybody studied it. Why did people listen to astrologists? Because astrologists deal with things that raise fears amongst most people. Because when people are afraid, they seek advice. When they are sick, when they're afraid, when they don't know if they should get married, when a country or a government does not know whether it makes sense to start a war, the same thing is happening today. Why economists are getting more money compared to historians. In the universities where I worked, economists are getting 3 times more. One economist is worth 3 historians because a professor in economics can find a job in the corporate world, but that is not the case with history scholars. They have nowhere else to go. Where can we go? We can go to psychologists, to political technology experts. We can get advice from lawyers or engineers. They are less significant, but still. So my biggest motto is we should scare them. We should scare the politicians, make them afraid. See what happens when you don't consult us. We should give them the idea that if they do not know about history, they will not be able to make good decisions today. That is the main conclusion. And again, people want to read about history before they go to bed. If they do, then probably we will be able to make a living. That's pretty much it. We should make our studies more accessible, easier to read for non-professionals, for an average person. One has to understand that we are looking at the history of several millennia. It's difficult to predict the outcome of a football match. However, if you watch several hundred football matches, you may become a good commentator. Thank you, Georgi. This is an interesting conclusion. Scare the hell out of them. We still have some time, and we want to address some questions from the floor, also get some comments. Some people who can and will, or maybe not, scare others. I have one question for all the panelists. You can draw any map. It can be the kind of map that Yuroslavsky has offered, or you can have a different presentation of the world. There may be other ideas. You can look at different contexts like David did. You can look at specific political trends and tracks that the other David mentioned. Why in recent times, especially in the last 10 years, we see a lot of active debates about the types of historic thinking in a political system. In the end of the 60s and in early 70s, we had the first energy crisis when suddenly the strong team of economists started playing a big role in several parts of the world, and we can now study that. But in the last 10 years, why are we so focused on history? Why do we refer to history as Queen of Sciences? What is happening in the world? Why, instead of astrology and economic studies, which are almost the same things to me, we see the arrival of history and history-based approach, history-based thinking? What makes non-historians, but government people, the establishment in different countries, look at history? What has happened? What made this history-based thinking relevant to our today's life? If each of you spends 2 or 3 minutes trying to provide an answer to this, I would appreciate that.
Why does this question come up? Well, I have 2 cynical reasons to start, neither of which reflect that well on historians. The first is that just as bureaucrats, nomenclatura, use the history for their own purposes, historians use applied history for their purposes. And certainly in the Anglophone world, a kind of crisis of employment among historians, which I believe is not unique, to say the least, is not unique to the Anglophone world, leads to more sort of a call to engage history in broader ways. Georgi alluded to that as well. And the second, I think, rests in a general, and this, I guess I'll be specifically about the American or Anglo-American profession. I think the calls to more historical knowledge in government come at a time when governments, historians don't like are in power. Obama was no historian. He, as did his predecessor George W. Bush, consult quietly, privately with historians. But somehow the call for applied history was weaker in those years. So those are two kind of broader, again, if more cynical, explanations. And the third is actually, I think, the coronation of economics, the queen of the social sciences, perhaps, as the lingua franca for social scientific advice. And I think a growing concern with, as economics has become more and more important in policy advising, economics as a profession has become less and less historical in it. So in its own thinking. And so there were moments where plenty of kinds of economists of the kind Georgi mentioned, John Kenneth Galbraith, were actually quite historically informed and historically minded. But the profession, the economics profession itself has changed in a way that has less room for historical thinking. Is that?
I'm not sure I noticed this. I don't think I noticed this, that people talk about history more. Well, historical metaphor and examples are used quite commonly, yes, but you said, well, that history is in more demand. Maybe so, but it's difficult to quantify. If it is so, then that could be explained by the general picture of the world, the way it's seen by the policy decision makers, journalists, and our students. Recently, political rhetoric was mainly about the economic growth. Clinton, remember, once said, "It's the economy, stupid," and that was repeated over and over again. After that, people started using it less frequently, because I believe in many politicians' minds, and not only politicians, they no longer felt that the world was predictable. They developed thinking that the milestones would change. There are like tectonic shifts in society. And history people would respond to that, and politicians using that response in their rhetoric. There's a lot of talk about the end of the empire. People in the States talk about that often. Do we see a decline of the empire? And they use different argumentation to support those points. Perception of Russia as an enemy that's being stepped up. It's a part, I believe, part of that feeling that the world is changing. The world is changing in a dangerous way. We have to realize this, and to realize this, we should look at the past. In Berkeley, where I used to teach for many years, the proportion of European history gradually went down, and Russian history, well, after Gorbachev, it went down slightly, and then it soared into the sky, because Russia is in the news almost every day. Every day it's in the news as a symbol of evil, and that mainly refers to historical symbols rather than economic formulas. The same is true, well, presented in a different way, but it's true also of China, I feel. And again, the picture of the world, the perception of the world. Some people feel that the world is changing in a radical way. It's not the economy that drives it, not only growth. It's not the economy stupid, we can call it. Or maybe it was Clinton who was actually stupid.
With Yuri, it seems to me that we're going through a period when the old assumptions, economistic assumptions, but more generally, I think, those economistic assumptions that the world, well, the assumption, it was a sort of social scientific view of the world, I suppose, which I think in periods of stability often take hold. And certainly particularly by the 1990s, there was I think a technocratic approach to politics, which was that it was the goal of politicians to promote growth, and one had to, I suppose, if we're thinking about on the centre left of politics, there was a view that that markets had to be curtailed, but in a rather technocratic way. And so, in a way, that produced a view of the world where economics was important, but also a social scientific approach. A lot of politicians were quite technocratic in their approach to the world. And that all seems to be in crisis because not just that the financial crisis of 2007-8 wasn't predicted or wasn't understood by many economists at the time, but more generally the sense that that political order hasn't been working and has left a lot of problems. And so I think that leads people to look at, as Yuri said, at the world as being one of change. And I think, just to come back to the points I made earlier, that actually is an opportunity for history as Mark Bloch described it. That is, looking at rather more historical forces at play than just some economic forces or forces of predictable social change, which social scientists find, in a way, much easier to track. And it's interesting, I think, the point about the 60s and 70s. I mean, it's an interesting parallel there, because clearly in the 70s there was another crisis of an earlier technocratic approach, if you think of to the world in the West, a sort of functionalist, sociological, sort of and there was a lot of criticism of technocracy. Whether that led to a renewed interest in history, I suppose you could say it led to a renewed interest in the West in a historical approach to social science, a Marxist approach to social science. So one could say that, in a way, that Marxist or New Left Marxist approach to, was a way in which people understood the crises of the time. After a period of stability, which was described very well by a particular type of social scientist. So we can make that parallel, I suppose, with the crisis now. And I think, as Yuri is saying, historians are really much better able to understand, this is a rather arrogant thing to say as a historian, but I think because if they do act as foxes rather than hedgehogs, and they do bring in various historical forces and look at the interactions between them, then perhaps people sort of intuitively realize that actually that seems to be a better type of set of explanations than the more sort of hedgehog-style social scientific one.
Можно я последним?
May I now? A question to the audience. Please find in YouTube a cartoon which is called True Untrue. It's from 1967. Soviet Union, 50 years of the Great October. The verse comes from Samuel Marshak. It starts like this, great phrase. There's thunder, there's rainstorm, 3 pioneers or scouts in run into the building, and then all guys come to them, to these three youngs, asking this question first. Whose house is this? What first says it's USSR, the other says it's nobody's, and the third one is Moscow municipal government. I showed that to the municipal government in Moscow. And then we say, we'll go march forward and we'll never get back. This is mid-20th century. It was exceptional time of social optimism everywhere. It's amazing. Like Vatican, Catholic Church, Second Congress also agreed that, right, there is secularization, but we're ready to live with it, that they said. One political force lost everywhere, and everybody was happy and thought they were took the merit for that, because fascism and Nazism was down. It's us, said the Soviets. It's us, said the Chinese, etc. Everybody claimed their victory. And that was over-optimism that there. And now people laugh about that. There are so many movies about the 60s, about cosmonauts, astronauts, so much optimism. You can only dream of that situation right now. So what's left to do? Formulate new, maybe national ideologists. Many appeared, whether they're legitimate or whether, well, new countries appeared, whether legitimate or not. They required a lot from history. And they're not using their own historians only. Bloodland, whose book is an outstanding one, Timothy Snyder. And there are books like this on the genocide of Cherkess people, a new history, creating a new history about particular national groups, ethnic groups. And Russia is apparently in the counter phase right now. New demands appearing in Russia. Well, why are history experts in demand right now? Because we lost optimism and the feeling of the future. It's is perceived as something very dangerous. Well, I again referred to this cartoon, 1967. There was another movie, The Head of Chukotka, it was called. Well, people would ask, how did they allow that film to be shot in the Soviet Union? Another example of that. And now 50 years have passed after this, and I said us, meaning everybody, all countries of the world. On the other hand, there's demand for historical national mythology as an anchor people can grab onto. Like in Armenia, they erect a monument to Armenian fascists. Not exactly so. Well, there were some outstanding national people who didn't love communists. The same in Poland, replacing Lenin with Grinstein. That's history moving into one direction, something in demand. The history that denounces previous history, and there's a minefield there, and the emotions are very unpleasant associated with this history. Should we there take the position of theoreticians here, just watching that process as an observer? That's to be discussed. Should we get involved, or will that pass in itself? That's it. Thank you. Thank you all for historians, so different from each other. Colleagues, we have some time. Questions. If we have any questions from the audience, please identify the person whom you want to ask the question, or you can ask from everybody. You're the first one, please. Thank you. I'm Tatiana Illarionova. I'm professor of this academy. My question is to Yuri Slezkin. Your map is not mainly about history, it's about policy of history, of organizing history and research. Kind of envy the fact that American and British historians publish these great works about Russian history. Their levels seem to be very high. And it's a question, Yuri. Why are they so good? why I agree in a way. It's a matter of organizing and funding, the availability of funding to finance history. But it's not only the organization of historical science or science in general. It's more. World empires study the whole world. Regional ones study their regions. Small national states study themselves. That's a bit of a generalization, but there's truth to it, I think. It's not that science is better organized and better funded. Like, say, well, it's not only the quality of their books. To have a good quality to books, you need to publish many books of varying quality. I don't have the numbers, but if it turns out that in English they publish at least the same amount of books about Russian history per year than Russia publishes, and it happens because in the Anglo-American world, especially the United States of America, studying Russia is a whole industry. The main professional event in the life of a Russia expert is an annual Congress of the American Association of Slavic and Eastern European and Eurasian Studies. And that is because it's a well-financed industry, and it's well-financed because America has a definite geopolitical interests associated with Russia. I agree with you in principle with your statement, but again, in brackets, many of us who regularly work in Russian archives, all of us present here do that work in Russian archives, and we all know you walk into any Moscow archive, or especially a Communist Party archive, and you see that half or more than half of our researchers are foreign researchers. Almost all of them are Americans, some Germans, and maybe one French among all, or maybe Italian. And we understand why. They are in the archives. That's associated with the organization of science in a certain way, but mainly it's associated with the place of a particular country in the world and its relation to the rest of the world. Thank you. Yes, I see. You will be next. Thank you. I'm Kirill Podyachev, the Federal Social Center of the Russian Academy of Sciences. It's a very interesting debate. I'm not a professional historian here. I'm a sociologist, politologist by background. But the main question is, and you didn't give an answer. Professor Sloskin says, a government may not have an army, but would have a school. The central question of history, whether it's political history, and teaching as a teaching subject, history as a teaching subject is very important, and professional historian form the foundation for that. But when you teach history, and history as a subject of political discourse, facts are secondary, interpretation is primary, and historical schools are very different in that respect. Excuse me, your question, please. Well, the difference, Napoleonic wars, well, in the central place for French would be Napoleon, the central person. For Russians, it would be Kutuzov. So, question is, for Russia, what is the most relevant interpretation of history right now? What's in light green, the English discourse space or European discourse space? There's a Soviet tradition, Marxian Leninist tradition. It's no longer there. Then the question is, what kind of tradition? Who's the central hero? The question addressed to whom? Yuri Sloskin? We heard, well, very briefly, to not take away much of the time from colleagues. As I said, there's a big difference between what professional researchers do and what's being taught at school. School textbooks are not written by the same professional historians. In blue countries, the textbooks are translated or interpreted from other sources, as you said. What kind of sources Russia does need right now for history textbooks, I don't have an answer to that. That is a political decision. And that decision would be taken in different countries in a different way. In some countries, they have an active government policy on that. In some countries, actually in the United States, it's different. But there's some consensus, though, where our colleagues, American studies, would rewrite the history of the United States all the time, because it's a very profitable thing, among other things, rewriting the textbooks. And they would rewrite those textbooks following a new wave of new wave of ideology, the change in ideological fashion. It's going top to bottom, in some countries bottom to up. Well, but I don't have an answer about Russia. Maybe some people would volunteer to answer that.
I'm Maria. I am a student at RANEPA. I'm a student from Afghanistan. I have a question for all of you. We know about the past of Afghanistan, and we know what is happening in Afghanistan today. In NATO, do they have any advisors that specialize in the history of Afghanistan? And do you think NATO is going to win the war based on the history of Afghanistan? This is a very general question. Therefore, we are going to invite Georgi to take it. Yes, they have such advisors, and I have met with some. I had a very interesting conversation years ago when they were preparing to launch invasion in Afghanistan. This is an open secret. Yuri Sloskin and I myself have started our careers in Mozambique, and they asked a question: what are the best kind of boots for a war in Afghanistan? And I asked people if they have ever read the books by Kipling. You probably have seen the movie The Man Who Would Be King, a very well-known film with Michael Caine and Sean Connery. Not many people have seen it. It was made mostly for the British audience. And the answer was, you have no idea about the capabilities of modern rotary wing aircraft. It is going to be completely different. We're going to finish it up in 2 or 3 weeks. There can be no war like in the 19th century. Today, we have technology, we have innovations. One of the classic mistakes that people make time and again, and Philip Tetlock brings it up over and over again, the strength of the new. Now we have the new technology. Now we have new kerosene lamps, and things are going to look differently. And then later, I heard the same stories about Chechnya. They told me this thing and the other. I remember December of 1979 when one of the Soviet commanders said, it's not fair. We have machine guns, and in Afghanistan they have ancient rifles. It's not fair game. You've asked me about history. Let me give you some homework. Go to the web and find an experimental history textbook in 3 volumes with a lot of pictures. It's a book by Sergey Nefyodov. Sergey Nefyodov, a historian from Yekaterinburg. He is an economist and he's a historian. He drew a lot of pictures on the ancient history and the medieval period and Renaissance. And journalists asked him, what is the best way to teach history in schools? And he said, you shouldn't teach history in schools. How can you give 12-year-olds the truth about the times of Ivan the Terrible? How can you teach Russian children about the invasion of the Tatars? How are you going to tell Tatar children about the siege of Kazan? How can you honestly teach history? It's always very political. I think that history, like literature, should be taught several times for young children, then for the grown people, and then for the mature people. I remember reading War and Peace when I was in the 7th grade. I remember reading The Crime and the Punishment when I was in high school. This was terrible. Well, we need to teach, though, because if you don't teach, somebody is going to teach for you. Others will write the textbooks that you don't bother to write. If you were at Gaidar Forum a year ago, in the last day, usually you would have sessions where Yevgeny Gozman and Mr. Satarov would make their presentations, and I was embarrassed to listen to that. They would say that nothing is going to work out in this country because we have the legacy of serfdom and this thing and the other. And I was thinking, do these people know how many serfs, what was the percentage of serfs in Russia in the 19th and in the 18th century? I do not know how we can make our case for funding agencies, but we should try harder. Look at how many websites on history we have in internet. Some of them are very good indeed. If you are interested, I can give you advice on various books and sources.
Друзья, боюсь, последний вопрос. Может быть, еще один.
Исеров, Институт общей истории Академии наук, Высшей школы экономики.
I work for the Higher School of Economics. I have a question for all panelists. Is there a fault of the historians community? We keep complaining that we are underrepresented, that people do not listen to us, that people do not provide enough funding. Do you think that historians are to blame for that? Since 1960s, they have given up. They have yielded to the new areas like political science and other things. They have given their field to other scholars.
I think the changes in the historical profession since the 1960s and 1970s, certainly in the Anglo-American profession, have made it much harder to articulate and connect with the kinds of questions that policymakers are interested in. I would note actually that this need not always be so. In the buildup of Sovietology in the 1950s, it actually paid a lot of attention to social questions, social stability, as being very important to the nature of understanding the Soviet Union. And those were the questions that policymakers were asking. And so, on the one hand, I think that the change is inevitable. Whether the change is actually quite important, I should say, change in the focus of the historical profession. But I would also say that the divorce, if you will, relies as much on policymakers only interested in narrow political questions rather than holding on to a broader vision of kind of a fuller history of society. So part of the problem is among historians, but another part, perhaps even the larger part, is among those in the policy world who are defining their questions in more and more narrow political ways.
Just agree with that. I think a lot is about politicians and particularly quite a technocratic approach to policy-making, but also I think I would also mention something I mentioned before, which was the way in which public communication now works, in which it's much easier. You know, if historians are emphasizing the complexity of the past, which I think they should do, it's often much easier for either for people who have a sort of an easy prediction or an easy law or an easy interpretation to get into the social media or to the media more generally, and therefore to attract the attention of politicians, and therefore they're more likely to be influential. So I think that, I think it's historians, it's probably on both sides, but I think the public discourse and politicians have a lot to do with it as well.
Но сейчас, секундочку.
Give me a second. I see that many of you want to ask questions, but we have to bring it to an end. I will make time for one final question. No offense. This is going to be the final question. We are having a very interesting discussion. Let me make one comment, though. What kind of history advisors do politicians need? Some just know history. Some interpret history. And it's important who gives advice to the policymakers and politicians. Interpreters of history or just people who know the history. Let me give an example. Our president recently quoted the Polish ambassador who spoke to Hitler, and that caused a lot of responses, a lot of reaction. So let us say it. What kind of advisors do our politicians need? Well, that's what we have spent the last 2 hours talking about. Well, there are different approaches, and you can look at it from different angles. If you want to repeat the whole session, we could possibly do it. I invite all the panelists to make a few final remarks, just a few words at the end. Georgi, let us start with you this time. Andrei, we are going to have another session about applied history. After the break? Georgi, was that the final comment that you wanted to make? Well, yeah, there will be another session, and I will be there as well.
Well, here over in Corpus One, I think, is the only historical panel sort of run by professional historians in the whole forum. So I'm so glad to see so many out. I do think, however, that all of these calls to history are themselves, for more historians, are themselves political. They are political on the part of historians, and they're political on the part of those calling for applied history, and they're political on the part of those using them. And so, ironically, the call for more historians is one that historians are perhaps ill-suited to answer directly or to fulfill as promised.
Thank you. Yuri.
Но я не уверен, что политикам нужно.
I'm not sure that politicians need historians as advisors. It's much nicer to be here at Gaidar Forum and complain about insufficient funding rather than be held responsible for the war in Iraq. Well, if you insist, though, well, somebody mentioned Bloodland by Timothy Snyder. I hope that there would be another historian other than Timothy Snyder who would give his view on history. And we hope we can make them talk.
I was extremely skeptical about the idea of historical advisors in politics, but actually having thought about it and having thought about the cases I spoke about, as I said, I think I'm convinced that actually it is a good idea for historians to have some involvement in the political process, not, I think, a council of political advisors who are specially plucked, who are going to be some exclusive group. But I think what one needs is as much historical and informed historical discussion as possible about the policy choices of the day. Of course, as I said, what matters is that the historians who give the advice are good historians or the right historians. Now, that is not just the historians I approve of, but I think what we need are historians who have a broad approach, are aware of multiple approaches. And I think that can be a problem in this sort of discussions, certainly one has in the United States and in Britain and lots of other countries, where it's the historians with the loudest voices and the easiest solutions and the sort of easiest approach who get the attention. So I think we need more historical discussion. We need more historical involvement in press and journalistic political conversations. We also need a more, as David said, more historical or historians involved in the education at schools. I mean, professional historians involved in advising on the sorts of things which should be taught at schools. So it's a breadth of historical discussion, I think I would be in favour of, rather than some sort of narrow selection of advisors.
Коллеги, я...
Colleagues, I want to say thank you to the four excellent historians that participated in our session. Also, thank you to the audience. Thank you for your contributions. We appreciate that. The journey goes on, and we will see each other again.